Okay, so the 11.624 Hurache paddles have been out for a couple months now, and since then they have exploded in popularity. Some are even saying that they are the better versions of the 6.0 double black diamond paddles. And now that the hype is slowly dying down, it really begs the question, are these paddles still worth getting? Well, today I'm going to try and help answer that question as well as do a full paddle review, so don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy, and let's jump into things. Alright, let's start off with the most popular version, and that would be the Hurache-X Control Plus. This is an $140 paddle and only $130 if you use my code DanielPB, which actually isn't too bad. It is a thermoformed edged paddle that has a 3-layer surface made of carbon fiber and fiberglass. It weighs 8.0 to 8.3 ounces. It has a swing weight of 117, a twist weight of 6.29, and it also has a grip length of 6 inches. In other words, this paddle is really great for two-handed backhanded players, but even if you don't use one, it still gives you that extra range too, which is nice. Anyways, here are the rest of the specs if you're interested, but now let's talk about the second paddle, the Hurache-X Control. This is an $150 paddle, $140 with the code DanielPB, and essentially the counterpart to the Hurache-X Control Plus. And the main difference between the two is that this paddle features a mix between carbon fiber with a top layer of Kevlar. Other than that though, all the specs are essentially the same, but here are all the specs still if you're curious. Anyways, now let's jump into the gameplay with these two paddles. Okay, starting off with power with the Hurache-X Control Plus, the raw carbon fiber version. So I'm going to start off by saying, even though this is listed as a control paddle, this thing still has a lot of kick to it. Carbon fiber version specifically hits really hard and kind of shoots off the paddle, almost like a trampoline. Not like a Gen 3 trampoline, but like a mini trampoline. Still, drives, overheads, or serves are just that much stronger because of it. I think a lot of the time when I use a quote-unquote control paddle, or specifically a 16mm paddle for that matter, I find myself having to put a ton more effort into generating power to make up for the thicker paddle, but that definitely isn't the case with this. Additionally, this paddle in particular shines even more when it comes to pop, because while the drives feel really solid, the pop game is crazy good. Like, the ball really launches off of this thing, which makes it great for making aggressive shots at the net. This is also the main reason that I think a lot of people compare it specifically to the double black diamond, but honestly, in my opinion, the Hurache-X Control actually pops just slightly more still. I specifically remember actually trying this out for the first time too, and having to even recalibrate myself a bit in order to keep the ball in on volleys and blocks because it was just that poppy. This poppiness, especially on a 16mm paddle, is definitely the main selling point for the Hurache-X Control Plus, but overall for power, I would give this paddle a 7.5 out of 10, and for pop, I would give it an 8 out of 10. All right, now let's compare that to the power of the Hurache-X Control, the Kevlar version. Okay, so overall, I would say the carbon fiber version is definitely more powerful than the Kevlar one. I don't think it's a massive difference, but at least for me, it's definitely noticeable in how much harder you need to hit the ball with the Hurache-X Control. The Kevlar face is just a bit harder and stiffer, and it really doesn't quite spring off the paddle like the carbon fiber version does. And in that sense, it actually feels very similar to the Ruby 6.0, which makes a lot of sense because they are both Kevlar surfaces after all. That said, I would say that this does hit a lot harder than the Ruby still, and you can still hit decently hard with it in general. You just have to rely a bit more on your own strength to generate that power. And when it comes to pop, I have to admit that the Hurache-X Control does still hold up a lot better than most Kevlar faced paddles. Again, I wouldn't say it's quite as poppy as the carbon fiber version, but the ball still does jump off the face harder than your average paddle. But still, anyways, overall for power, I would give this paddle a 7 out of 10, and for pop, I would also give it a 7 out of 10. All right, moving on to control. While both are actually very good when it comes to the control game, hence the names, I'd say the Kevlar version does have a slight edge when it comes to this specific area. Because the Hurache-X Control Plus version, aka the carbon fiber face, is a bit more poppy, it does make it a little more challenging to place the ball for drops or even dink sometimes. But since the Hurache-X Control is a bit more mute, it makes predicting how the ball will come off the paddle, well, more predictable, and it just makes the control game a bit more consistent in general. Oddly enough though, I will admit it actually took me a bit longer to get used to the Kevlar version, but once I did, it became just easier to use overall. All that said, I did really like how both paddles really had that grabby feel to them whenever you went to place the ball, which isn't always the case for paddles, but for both of these, I felt like you could really get under the ball and guide it wherever you wanted. In the end, both are very solid paddles for the control game, but for the Hurache-X Control Plus version, I would give it a 7 out of 10 for control, and for the Hurache-X Control Kevlar version, I would give it a 7.5 out of 10. All right, now on to spin. In general, both of them were fairly solid for spin all around. Also, both of them are actually fairly similar too when it comes to how much spin they can generate, but with that said, I think the Kevlar version initially has a bit more spin to it. However, the grit on the raw carbon Carbon Fiber version, or the Hurache-X Control Plus, has actually lasted a bit longer, so now I'd say that it probably generates slightly more spin over the Kevlar one. For reference to, this was a bit over a month of solid consistent use. It's also worth noting though that while the Kevlar version or the Hurache-X Control does feel pretty smooth already from being used, it still is able to generate a good amount of spin. Overall though, I'd say both are so similar for spin that I would give them both a 7 out of 10. Alright, now let's quickly talk about sweet spot. So overall, I actually don't have too much to say here, as both these paddles were pretty good. There were definitely times I hit dead spots on both of them, but even when I did, it wasn't terrible. Like, the ball didn't completely die like it has with some other paddles that I've used, which is nice. I like it when the ball doesn't just completely drop over and die. Overall, not too bad with the sweet spot, and pretty standard all around. For both of them, I would give a 7 out of 10 for sweet spot. All right, moving on to cons for both of the paddles. So to start, one of the biggest cons that I've discovered so far is an issue with delamination. I've had a bunch of friends that have had Huraches, which they really like, but a few of them have also run into issues with their paddles delaminating. I haven't personally run into this issue myself yet, but it is something to be on the lookout for. All that said, it is worth noting that 11624 has been really good about their customer service in helping them. All my friends who have had issues got helped and taken care of very quickly, so that is definitely a big pro, especially because not all paddle companies are like that. The only other really small con that I had was with the Control Plus, and that was it's kind of loud. Like, this is definitely louder than your average paddle when you hit with it, and even on the louder side for raw carbon fiber paddles. Still, it's not a huge deal as you get used to it pretty quickly, but it's still something to take into consideration. Also, quick side note, this isn't really a con, but it is worth mentioning that the Kevlar version, at least for me, took a solid amount of time to warm up. Like, I remember playing with it right out of the box and it not hitting hard at all, but after a few solid sessions of playing with it, it definitely got a lot better and easier use, so it is something to consider. The Hurache Control Plus version, on the other hand, played hard right out of the box though, so it was a bit of a difference in immediate playability. Anyways, let's jump into my final thoughts with these paddles. So first off, I want to say I actually really like these paddles. They are definitely one of my favorites to use so far. And I'm not alone with that, as I have 6 or 7 friends who all play with Huraches. That said, I personally like the Hurache-X Control Plus a lot more than the Kevlar one. I just really like the feel a lot better, and I also like the power and poppiness of it. I just think there's still plenty of control left over to justify going for the more powerful version. I do wish it was a bit softer and had a bit plusher of a feeling to it, but in general, it's really a great paddle. I do think most people would prefer this over the Kevlar one too. Plus, it is $10 cheaper, so there is that too. I do, however, think the Kevlar version is still good for someone who already hits ridiculously hard and or would like a bit more consistency in controlling their game. But at the end of the day, the paddles are so similar that it really just comes down to preference. And specifically, do you like the feel of a carbon fiber paddle or a Kevlar paddle? Also, quick side note, I also just remembered that I put 3 grams of weight to the top of this just to help it hit a little bit harder to test it out. And I actually kind of liked it, but it really is just a preference thing. But anyways, to answer my question earlier on, are these still worth getting today? I would definitely have to say yes, as on top of being just great paddles in general, these are just really fun to use too. But yeah, anyways, that's all I got. If any of this is helpful, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Peace.